Okay, good morning, everybody. Thank you for getting up bright and early. So today is the second episode of the hottest show in town, our two-part meeting with Elsie Kanza. Elsie, as you know, is the Tanzanian ambassador to the United States and Mexico, class of 2000, CDE, winner of numerous awards and accolades. The way we organized this was yesterday, Elsie told us about her career, her work, and we had some Q&A around that. But today the idea is to look ahead to development prospects for Africa more broadly, and of course Tanzania in particular. And we did kind of segue into that towards the end of yesterday's discussion. We talked about the free trade area, the role of the diaspora, and so on. I should say up front that the audience, including me, consists of two types of people. There's people who are interested in development, that's pretty much everybody in this room, but is not an Africa specialist. That includes me. And there's about half of the CDE class is from Africa, and so of course by definition you're a specialist, or at least you should say you are, right? So the Q&A has to sort of reflect the needs of both this category of people. So if you ask a question that's very Africa specific, you might take a moment to tell the audience what you're talking about, especially if you use an abbreviation. Not everybody will know what that abbreviation means. Okay, so I've just picked a bunch of things that jumped out as me in my capacity as development economist, not Africa specialist. And the issue the first issue that I want to talk about is really foreign direct investment of various kinds. It's always been highly desirable in developing countries. It's also always been highly controversial. I was telling Elsie that I opened up The Economist and searched for the phrase "scramble for Africa." This has a long and odious history going back to the colonial period. And there are 4 articles in The Economist itself with this title between November 25th, 2004 and March 14th, 2024. So I guess I was just wondering, the most visible, I think, new FDI innovation, if you like, or entrant is China and the Belt and Road Initiative. But now there's the Gulf states, there's India, Turkey, all kinds of people. I just want to give you, again, it's a fairly open-ended question about, would you like to comment on sort of pros and cons of FDI in maybe Tanzania in particular, Africa more generally?
Thank you, Anand, and good morning to everyone. It's good to be with you again. So starting off from a very basic premise is that we need resources to be invested so that we can grow our economies, transform our societies, and those investments need to come from somewhere. And as many of our countries coming out of colonialism, essentially young countries, they're still quite young in terms of maturity. And by that, I'm also referring to the ability to raise revenues, sufficient revenues domestically to be able to finance our budgets, were initially highly dependent on development assistance, and that would fill the gap in terms of investments that need to be made. We've seen a shift globally in terms of the availability of aid, and increased discussions about shifting from aid to trade, which is a recognition that our traditional development partners are no longer able to fill the gaps that we have, and also take into account that our needs were growing as well as our populations were growing. And so that also created pressure in terms of the traditional go-to assistance, a source of investment. With the shift to trade and investment, it's basically saying, well, let's go to the private sector. And you have large corporations globally that have done very well. How can they work with the governments, and governments meaning our development partners as well as our own governments, to close that gap? And that's where you have the whole discussion about foreign investments, foreign direct investments. I'd say the complications that arise is that particularly when you're shifting from dealing with what we say government to government, engagements, and that could be multilateral corporations as well. In IFIs, I'm referring to like the World Bank Group or the African Development Bank Group. There's a particular way of negotiating with those partners in terms of what are the terms. Is it a grant? Is it a loan? And similarly with the private sector, it's very different terms that apply. It's not the same as G2G. And with companies, they also, in terms of how they assess their bottom line, you're talking about profits, you're not talking about doing good out of the goodness of your heart, right? Or some moral obligation in some cases where you have countries that feel, oh, we're well off, and so we want to share the benefits of being well off with those that are less well off. And where the tensions start to arise is when you have situations where it seems that the developing countries are getting a raw deal. It doesn't have to be a developing country, but it's just in terms of the transactions. And going back to the question of, how do you get commitments, contracts, but contracts are not sufficient in and of themselves. With companies can take on projects with a long gestation period, thinking here, say 10 years, 20 years, not a problem. With governments, you have election cycles every 4 years, 5 years, so there's some disruption that's inherently built into the system. And so there's always questions about, well, how do you then ring fence those contracts? How can we create robust projects that are able to survive those different cycles, as well as the different needs on the part of governments? So that's on one part. The other shift that we've seen is, again, stemming back to our colonial history, you had traditional investment partners. So for Anglophone countries, the UK played a big role. For Francophone countries, France played a big role. And so with the shift with Scramble for Africa is we're now seeing new players. There were not necessarily 8 partners, development partners in the past, but definitely seeing the potential that Africa has. And the tension arising therein was different value systems being introduced. People who do business in different ways, and some would argue that this was also challenging to our traditional investment partners and the assumptions with which sort of underpinned the transactions. Here I'm thinking about, values is one of the controversies. How do you treat your people, right? What's a decent salary, for instance? For some people, or for some cultures, that's built into your salary. For others, it's, work it out. There's a limit to what is the responsibility of the company. But then in countries where you have a dominance, for instance, Tanzania was socialist, you had an expectation that comes with a government being your employer, where there's quite a bit of generosity in terms of what you can expect in terms of being catered for that the private sector would never do in a capitalist society. So those are some of the areas where some tensions with foreign investment arise from, but then we all need it. So we're always trying to figure out what's a good deal, what's a not so good deal, how can we rally together, for instance, whether it's the oil producing countries, so you have OPEC, so you set standards and everyone has to deal with you based on those standards. We're talking about it now for agriculture. You saw what happened with Ghana and Cote d'Ivoire when they decided as major cocoa producers to try and renegotiate the prices that their farmers were able to obtain from global markets based on the cocoa that they're producing. We're seeing it emerge now with critical minerals, where again you have a cluster of countries that account for the majority of those minerals, also trying to say, hey, we're going to band together so that we can get as good the best deal possible, but ensuring that there's a level playing field.
So so Elsie, I mean that was a really lucid two-part answer. I just wondered, not everybody in the room will know about the negotiation for better prices for agricultural products, or even for critical minerals. So maybe you could just explain a little bit in some detail what those issues are.
Well, one core issue is that the continent has, particularly sub-Saharan Africa, has particularly been trapped, if I can use that word, in an economic situation where we are constantly exporting raw commodities, so commodities that have no value addition. And for the continent is natural resource rich, which means that there are certain commodities, the bulk of which are found in Africa and are very important to the rest of the world. But because of the imbalance in terms of where value is added, in terms of who the end consumers are, the continent has remained perpetually in a poor state, if I can put it that way. We say it's a rich continent, but poor people. Because the value of the natural resources that we have are not being retained within the continent. So if you think about the value chain, let's take coffee for instance. You produce the coffee, so you are farming, you have inputs that go into that production. Think about seeds, fertilizer, irrigation, there's employment as well that's entailed. You go to auction and you sell essentially dried coffee beans, and those coffee beans are exported, so you already have less than, say, 20% of the actual final price. And so you go to Starbucks and you're paying $8, right, a kilo, whereas the farmers at the producer level are getting less than $2 per kilo. Why? Because most of the value comes from processing the coffee and packaging it and marketing it. And so the challenge there is that the source of the coffee is still those poor farmers, right? And more affluent consumers in the world are benefiting from that same coffee. But that's where the imbalance comes from. And Africa is saying, well, we need to shift more of that value chain to the continent so that we're able to get more return for our own resources. So instead of having 80%, I'm just using a simplification here of the Pareto principle, 80% of the value being created outside the continent, why don't we shift the balance and have 80% retained in the continent, and 20% then benefiting others outside of the continent, so that we can use our own resources to transform our own lives. So instead of waiting for resources from elsewhere, then why not use what we have? But that's the imbalance we have. Now, if you ask why isn't that happening faster, it seems so obvious. There are some, again, inherent challenges in being developing economies. One is if you have to process, it means you need factories, it means you need electricity, it means you need technology. That's a very important component. It's estimated that 60% of the continent is still in the dark, which means they don't have access to any kind of electricity. And so this is a challenge. So even before you talk about setting up processing factories, you think about how do we get basic access to electricity to people so that they're not living in the dark, they're living in the light, and so that slows down that process of transformation. And so this is why they're complementary sectors that our countries, and here I'm including government and private sector, but governments in particular, because the core function of investment in infrastructure has traditionally been the responsibility of governments, are struggling with wanting to see more value being retained, but the reality of not having the right enabling environment. And so the discussions we have right now and the ongoing interventions, even with our traditional development partners, is, well, instead of you giving us support that goes directly into our budget, why don't we use the limited resources that you have to help us improve our enabling environment and make it easier for the private sector to come in, because we're closing the gaps that they wouldn't face in other parts of the world. So there's, again, a third element, which is global competition. If foreign investment can go to Asia, it will, as opposed to Africa, because their conditions are better. If American capital can stay in America because it's easier to go to market faster, there's no reason why they should come to Tanzania and have to figure everything out. To say, I don't have to figure that out in the US. At the end of the day, I'd like to be profitable as fast as possible. Why should I take 5 years? It's not logical, so to speak. And so that's really our key concern in terms of how do we attract more investment, is to say, how do we speed up the modernization of our enabling environments such that we can be equally attractive to investors, and hopefully in the process then be able to retain more value for our own resources.
So it seems like the issues also, I mean, there's a new set of issues on the table because with the new green technologies,
Sure.
you know, minerals like cobalt, for instance, have become extremely important and all concentrated in Congo. And so there's sort of a new scramble, if you like, for a new set of minerals than there used to be. So, like I was mentioning to you, I was reading this piece in The Economist which mentioned, I forget who it was quoting. He was saying, we don't want the Congo to become an OPEC of cobalt. But as a reader, you're thinking, why not? I mean, from the United States may not want, but why wouldn't Congo or an owner of a mineral that's scarce want the best price for it? And so you can see the prospects for that down the road. One issue that occurred to me, which is probably which has been a source of some controversy, and you can analytically see the point, is that the lending and the lending from the World Bank or the IMF and so on. It's not actually said, but the idea that repayment won't show up exactly on time and will have to be rescheduled is sort of implicit. It's was understood by a lot of lenders. Presumably now, with private capital coming in, they don't either have the luxury or that inclination, and so the hard repayment deadline, in principle, that has the potential to bite into living standards and so on. I mean, is that been an issue or a source of controversy?
So just to be clear, you're referring to indebtedness, because it's where the pressures arise from, the inability to meet payments on time.
Yeah, I guess I'm thinking that the World Bank giving concessional loans is one thing, but a public-private partnership where there's a loan component as well as an investment component from a foreign multinational or from a foreign government, they would be less inclined to reschedule and so on.
I'd say yes and no, depending on the nature of the transaction. Because starting off with sort of PPPs and taking into account the complexity of projects and the evolution that can take place over time, it's best practice to build in touch points or milestones where you can renegotiate terms that take into account changing realities. So that is accepted practice, and that prevents just an outright slippage. Where you have major challenges is where cases of high indebtedness occurs, which means just think about it on an individual basis. When you overborrow, you have multiple credit cards, and so each credit card company thinks that theirs is the only one, and so when they assess your ability to pay, you look great. But if they knew that there were 9 other credit card companies that you were leveraging, your credit worthiness would sink rapidly. And so where we work with particularly with the Bretton Woods institutions, but not only, we also have some UN bodies that assist us, is first and foremost that we are still developing. We are still putting in place institutional frameworks, policies and regulatory frameworks that can allow us to have modern and robust economies. So even as we talk about the concessional lending, there's a lot of other processes that underlie or underpin the nature of our engagement. So for instance, both of the World Bank and the IMF, you have regular assessments of how your economy is doing. They're constantly checking in with the government, even at a sectoral level, even from beneficiary level, to see whether the monies that were agreed upon or the projects were agreed upon are delivering as they should, that are delivering the results that they should, and therefore that offers the opportunity for a review. With the private sector, you don't necessarily have that kind of check-in, but they do it informally through third parties, so they still read the World Bank's reports, they read the IMF's assessments. In the case of the US, for example, they count on the State Department, right? to give them an honest view of what is happening. We also have sovereign credit rating bodies that again play that similar role. We're very grateful as Tanzania that our sovereign credit rating has been improving because that's a third-party assessment about how you're actually doing, about what the conditions are, whether it is politically, whether it is as far as governance is concerned, whether it's as far as accountability, because when you're using, if you agree on a project and you decide to divert those resources, then that to some extent is theft, some might call it that. But if somebody else assesses that and says, you cannot count on this government because you may have one kind of agreement, but resources are diverted, then people will be less willing to engage with you. So there's these inbuilt checks and balances that these third, let me call it pillar institutions play, and it's really critical. So it's not just the money that you receive, it's actually the hand-holding that goes with it, and therefore when you get shocks, so for example, with the Ukraine-Russia conflict, we're all hit with pressures on supply chains for certain crops that we were dependent on, countries in the region were dependent on, from Ukraine in particular. There were fuel shocks, so we saw prices of fuel go up almost by over 40%, and yet the quantity of fuel that we were actually importing had not gone up, and that created and has created inflationary pressures across the continent, not just in Tanzania, so it creates other pressures. So under those conditions, it becomes very difficult. So if my fuel bill, and this is an import bill, has shot up, and here I'm not even talking about the issues we've had with the dollars and how the efforts by the administration in the US to sort of curb inflation has created pressures and shortages of dollars for our economy, and that has created its own set of pressures, is you need to be a little bit more flexible. It's not the country per se that is having difficulties, it's also exogenous circumstances that can create pressures and that may lead to loans not being repaid or not being paid on time, and that opens grounds for negotiation.
So, which sort of leads me nicely into the next question, which you've already partly answered, which is, so I'm sort of revealing my age here a little bit, but when I was, it seems to me that when I was a college student, certainly, and then before the Asian crisis, for sure, in the late 1990s, the international financial institutions, the IMF in particular, had a reputation in the developing world for being doctrinaire, for having one sort of one-size-fits-all approach to repayment. And I think on the political left, there was to be this phrase called the IMF riot, which was the IMF team flew in, negotiated a stabilization program that involved cuts in social spending. For whatever reason, maybe the government's choice or whatever, it fell on food, and then when it seems like, I'm not in the IMF, looking from the outside, it seems like the IMF has become more, there's a kinder, gentler IMF. The IMF now talks more about poverty than it used to, even inequality, gender, and so on. So I wonder if you can comment on that, what it feels like at the recipient end. Sort of, have the international financial institutions become easier for you to deal with, more flexible, et cetera, over time?
Yes, because we have come a long way, let me put it that way. So there was a time where we had fiscal imbalances that really needed some tough love, if I can call it that. So it was very painful in terms of the shifts that had to be made to budgets, but we've seen improvements happen in many of our economies that that makes it more palatable now. We have better performing budgets overall, and not under pressure to tighten our belts. Tightening belts becomes necessary so that your economy doesn't go out of control. And yes, also as a result of the negative impact of tightening belts too much in terms of the impact on society and the backlash from people by not having access to basic services that were hitherto being provided by governments, also created, I'd say, more of introduced more of a conservative element, that even when we want to introduce tough measures, we need to be mindful about how fast we're pushing for changes, and essentially find a way to create resilience or mitigate the negative impact on society. Because you may be trying to get more discipline in a government, but not measuring what that impact, that increased discipline of government management, of financial performance, and just managing the economy overall, so macroeconomic and fiscal management, could have on people, which is actually real lives. What we're pushing for, and you've probably seen this in the news, there's a lot of talk about the reform of the IFIs, and sum it up into three main buckets. One is that the funding of these IFIs is still from the more developed countries of the world. And so our needs are still huge and growing, and this is for developing countries around the world. This is not just Africa. But the funds have to be replenished, and those are actually donations from the more advanced economies in the world. So there the appeal continues that we haven't arrived yet, right? So please continue to be generous, and rather than providing, say, direct assistance to countries, doing it through these institutions hopefully creates a loop that you loan out money, that money gets repaid, that money can then be used by another country. The second area of reforms that are being called for is in terms of operational efficiency. So on one hand, we count on these IFIs to be our partners and handhold us as we go through this journey of transformation. On the other hand, they also have their own form of bureaucracy. So one key area of concern, which came about because of good governance, is procurement processes. Procurement processes take a really, really long time. At one point, that probably made sense because you wanted to make sure that countries got the best deal when they put out tenders. But when we need quick turnarounds right now for infrastructure projects, there's a lot of questions about whether the cheapest bidder is really the best way to proceed, and taking 12 to 18 months just to design projects, go through procurement processes, means it can easily take 2 years before a project gets off the ground. And there's increased calls to say, we can't, that's just too slow, we're moving too slow. But those changes have to take place within the bank. There's disbursements. You can get a loan, but then the ability to disperse also has some prerequisites. Again, there's pressures there. You say, okay, we signed the agreement, but then the funds get dispersed several months, if even more, down the road. Then what's the value of that? Because the payment period doesn't change. And so that's an area where there's pressures to say, can these organizations become more efficient, even as they become more mindful of the realities on the ground. And the third key area is one of representation, where, for example, with the World Bank, Africa receives about 70%. It's 70% recipient of IDA funds. They have 4 MDs and not a single one is African. So there's no Africa is in senior leadership. So this also becomes a concern, because when you think about diversity of views when you're making decisions, and who introduces a reality check is also by being in the room where those decisions are being taken, to be able to provide a perspective that is directly relevant to your context, as opposed to being one that is common across the world.
Thank you, Elsie. So I want to move on. I will move on to my next topic, but before that, I just wanted to see if there's any follow-up questions on this class of issues, FDI, debt, the international institutions, because I'm going to switch gears rather drastically now. You can save up your questions for later if you want, but if anything that anyone wants to raise at this point.
Or you can also share your country experiences.
Yes.
Thank you very much. I just want to talk about, you've been talking about development. And we know when you talk about development, it cannot go without investment. And one of the key components of investment is FDI. So where we come from, especially in Africa, we have seen a shift now we've seen that the remittances, they outweigh the amount of FDI that are coming into the country. And for FDI, we need strong institutions, at least to attract good FDIs to the country. But these remittances now, what they are causing is that they have an impact at the micro level, but coming to CDE, I have learned that they actually did not lead to economic growth. In fact, they tend to cause a negative economic growth in the country because the people now, they don't care about what the government is doing as far as they can help somebody in the outside, in the West, can send them money, they can go to hospital, they can eat, they can take their kids to school. So accountability in the government now has reduced due to these remittances, which also tend to cause what? Weak institutions, which tend to cause what? Lower FDIs in the countries. So this put us in the catch-22 situation now. So remittances are having an impact on the micro level, but in fact harming the country at the macro level. While FDI, which is good for investment, is also like washing away. So how do we address these catch-22 situations that we are facing right now?
It's a good question. My short answer would be that our countries vary. So the statistic that I'm familiar with, in particular with respect to remittances, is more ODA than FDI. It's that remittances are outpacing development assistance in terms of volume. With FDI, that would honestly really vary depending on the country. And similarly for remittances, it also depends on the size of your diaspora. So that would be a very unique circumstance, because to be able to receive large transfers, you need to have a sizable population that is sending those transfers. So in countries where you have a large population outside of the country, then that's a scenario that could easily play out. Where you have a smaller population outside the country vis-a-vis the population in country, that would be difficult to play out as you've envisioned, that it could actually outpace sort of FDI. So in our case, we have, and in quite a few countries, so we see this, I'll just speak more from a sector basis, where we see FDI flows really increasing rapidly, and technology in particular, when you think about fourth industrial revolution technologies, just digitalization, where you have billions and billions of dollars that are flowing primarily to 4 countries in the continent, so that's South Africa, Nigeria, Kenya, and Egypt. With respect to mineral resources, you also have billions and billions of dollars that are flowing to countries that are rich in those mineral resources. And so the scenario that you've painted, I understand it and I appreciate it, but it would be a very unique one that I personally cannot speak to because I'm not familiar with it. But I think it raises good questions and also highlights how different our countries are. So we have to think differently about, depending on the context that you're in.
Yeah, I guess one would imagine that the impact varies, right? I mean, it's even after this, some variant of this is the resource curse. People would say, having oil or diamonds or whatever is harmful because you don't need to build up institutions, you don't need to build up taxation systems. So, but we also know that the resource curse doesn't always apply, and there are countries that use their resources really well. So I can see remittances having sort of a perverse effect in some instances, but surely it's nice to have foreign exchange reserves. It's nice for a household that's in trouble to have a check, to get a check. I know that the Indian economy gets lots of remittances, a few percent of GDP, India, Pakistan, Bangladesh. And you would be hard pressed to find someone argue that that's a net negative. The households, of course, love it, but so I would imagine that this is something you need to be concerned about and aware of, but also cautious about generalizing, because surely there must be cases where remittances are playing a really positive role as well. But I guess that's just my view. So,
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador, for presentation from yesterday. Actually, I wanted to ask my question yesterday, but we didn't really have much time. You had talked about public-private partnerships in Tanzania, and they seem to work very well. Zambia is just trying to embark on public-private partnerships because our fiscal space has been shrinking. Then I know the International Monetary Fund in particular has been very cautious on that, and they've been advising us not to be in a hurry, because most of the lessons that have been drawn from even the developing countries are that PPPs are not so easy to implement. Yeah, I wanted to find out from Tanzania how you went about. Was the legal framework already in place the time that you started leveraging PPPs? And also, how do you prioritize projects in terms of which ones are going to be embarked on? Is it coming from the demand side or the supply side? Because I know the contingent liabilities are quite huge in some of the public-private partnerships, even the ones that we're trying to do in Zambia. So I would just like to learn maybe a few projects that have been very successful. But if at all there are some that haven't been successful, I'd like to find out what could have happened around those. Thank you.
So correction number one, I think it's arguable to say that we have done well with PPPs. PPPs are complex, so I would not put us in that category at all. And we have been undertaking reforms, so the process has also been slow in terms of getting, creating a pipeline of PPP agreements. So just recently, we amended the law after a long consultation process with the private sector, because there were concerns that the legal framework as it was not conducive for PPPs. Other reforms that are underway is actually a hiving off of what was a PPP unit in the Ministry of Finance is now being set up as a full-fledged agency just to focus on PPPs. So you can see that there are efforts underway to essentially, first of all, create a stronger institutional framework, and that includes staffing. So with setting up an agency, that's a major undertaking by the government to just say, okay, we don't just need a small department, right, in a full ministry thinking and dealing with this often very complex transactions, but we actually need to invest in setting up an institution and having specialists who can assist us, particularly going through the negotiation processes and addressing very well documented shortcomings arising from PPP contracts globally. This is not just in developing countries, but also advanced economies have their own learnings in terms of PPPs. So the jury is still out. Right now, say, okay, with these reforms, are we going to see more private sector operators put up their hands and say we want to, or are willing to invest in PPP projects in Tanzania? Then we'll know. And if they are actually successful, meaning that they actually get to profitability, so not just starting, not just design, not just development, but actually get to profitability, then we'll know that at least we have a working framework, and if we can create pipelines of projects, then that would be even more successful. Zooming out, where at least I'm seeing more a high interest, a heightened interest in PPPs is in the renewable energy space. So you have some successful frameworks with South Africa, Kenya as well has done quite well in terms of, there's a lot of renewable energy projects are also more attractive for private sector participation. And there you see pipelines of projects that have gone through. And so at least for the renewable energy sector, there seems to be a formula that works. And so it's just saying, okay, what can we learn from this context and see what our framework looks like. Broadly speaking, when you talk about, well, you know, how projects assessed, in general, and this is probably true for Zambia, is that the origination of projects usually starts from the sector level. And then we have an assessment, we have a planning commission that used to be part of the Ministry of Finance as well, that has to assess projects in light of the roadmap that the country has. And then the Ministry of Finance has to assess the terms, right? And that determines which way it goes. Is it going to be off budget? Is it going to be in the budget? Will it be financed, say, through development partners? And here I'm thinking about DFIs, right? Like the Commonwealth Development Corporation or IFC, International Finance Corporation of the World Bank Group, or do we go to market, which means you put it out to the private sector purely? That's an assessment that usually takes place with the Ministry of Finance. Now, when I was with the World Economic Forum and working on infrastructure projects, and he has said we're looking at projects where we could crowd in the private sector, one, infrastructure was an area of frustration for policymakers on the continent, because the complaint, and also this was from our African Union Commission bodies, was that the government say, well, each time we say, why don't you come and also invest in infrastructure, the private sector would say you don't have bankable projects. But we have all these projects. Even under the AU, you have, there's a PIDA, they call it, so it's a program for infrastructure development in Africa that had projects that were prioritized by countries in Africa. Many of them also intended to provide regional connectivity. And then even with PIDA, there's a PIDA PUP, which is priority action projects, right? So a prioritization of those priorities. And so with the World Economic Forum, we said, well, let's work with these priorities that have been identified by African governments, and then work with private sector companies that invest in infrastructure projects around the world, and help them understand how the private sector assesses projects to determine what is bankable and what is not bankable. Small example, when we talk about electricity generation, transmissions, where you have highways, if we can put it that way, very difficult to get private sector participation in. How do you collect the repayments? So it's really a space that is more geared towards investment by the public sector. Power generation, on the other hand, is one where the private sector can easily come in as long as they have an off-taker. It doesn't have to be done by the government. And so with this pool of projects, and through this project, which took about 5 years, was a very deliberate and intentional process to actually have, and you can go look this up, by the way, there are a lot of reports that were produced to make it easier to make the assessment about exactly what elements the private sector looks for when they're assessing an infrastructure project. And then that includes also IRRs, so the ability to actually generate returns. What it led us to was an even smaller group of, or cluster of priority projects based on 3 main categories, those that were purely of interest to the public sector. Those that needed some de-risking elements of sorts, so some enhancements, and therefore would be primed for more blended finance, and where you could have DFIs play a role and have some public resources, and then have the private sector, but not purely private sector, but needing a combination of actors. And then you had those that made sense to the private sector and could be invested in 100% by the private sector. So that process, and there's lots of reports, very happy to provide links so that you can refer to them, because a part of what we're doing was also building capacity within the public sector to be able to determine what makes sense. Not all projects that need to be undertaken in a country make sense for private sector engagement. And what was missing was the capabilities in the governments to be able to make that assessment and say, okay, so we have a portfolio of projects which are based on the needs of our country. How are we going to finance these projects? What projects make sense to which stakeholder group? And then there's a further drilling down, which is also to make sure you have the right paperwork for them, investment terms, and Tom will probably know this from, you need investment memorandums. I don't know if you know how to write one, quite complex. It's a language in and of itself, which is very different from the documents you would prepare to submit an application to the World Bank, for example. So there's elements of capacity that also emerged as a gap. It's also, even after you've determined what should be targeted to the private sector, are you able to create the right documentation and have the right data? And then the next stage would be, can you negotiate? And so one of the initiatives that also arose is a program funded by a company based in France, which is actually training people, public sector officials, in terms of how to deal with highly complex infrastructure projects, because the founder of this company was so frustrated that he saw the needs. He's originally from Africa. He's investing in multi-billion-dollar projects all around the world and was not able to make inroads on the continent. And the big issue is, I said, I sit with my lawyers and they can't negotiate because you're not speaking the same language. And so he's actively, invested in training public sector officials. So at least that when you have the private sector show up with their lawyers, they're able to speak the same language with their counterparts across the table and help these projects get to financial close and to actually get implemented.
Yeah, so let's take one more, or maybe a couple more questions on this issue, and then we should move on because FDI is not the only. Yeah, but Mustafa?
It's exciting.
Thank you, Ambassador. I want to ask you two questions related to the Africa trade agreement. So far, Africa have a lot of regional trade agreements, like for example, we have West African Community Agreement. So one of the main challenges regarding this trade agreement is infrastructure, not only infrastructure, but also like poor connectivity. The inter-flight or like flight routes in Africa is very complicated. Only, I think, the Gambia and Rwanda are the only countries that issues like free visa for all African countries. Imagine my country had joined in East African Community last December, but I need visa to make trade in your country, Tanzania. So do you think that we still need to consider such kind of like complicating the travel or movement in Africa? My second question is related to issues of harmonization for tariffs. The inter-trade tariffs in Africa, the imports in Africa, is more expensive than the imports comes from outside. So do you think that Africa is also still needs to room for improvement in harmonization regarding these tariffs, unless these agreements will not work? We don't have like this kind of harmonization. Thank you.
I agree with you. And many would agree with you. The toughest part of harmonizing free trade agreements is addressing the tariffs issue. And as I alluded to yesterday, part of it is trade-offs, right? So if you are already counting on, say, excise duties to, and it's a significant component of your budget frame, and they say, okay, we've signed this trade agreement, which by the way is not done by Ministry of Finance, it's the Ministry of Trade, and it demonstrates that by adopting a certain tariff level, there will be an immediate loss, in a significant loss of revenue in the short term. That becomes a very tough discussion. The other element to think about is even as we think about inter-Africa trade, and I'll just use the example of Tanzania, where even with the industrialization, still seeing a lot of inputs being imported from outside the continent. And so that begs the question about whether these inputs can be sourced inside the continent. And that could make the tariff discussion also a lot more palatable. So there are certain realities that exist that underpin that, but it's constant negotiation. Even within the recs that exist, that's part of the challenges of having them be highly effective, is that you still don't have full harmonization of various tariffs. And then from time to time you have non-tariff barriers that arise and require negotiations. We've certainly seen that happen in East Africa, where we've had escalation of issues that has necessitated interventions by ministers of countries to figure out what has happened and why there's a disagreement. So yes, you are correct, and that is definitely and something that our trade negotiators have to deal with. And I'd just add another layer of complexity, which is that you also have trade agreements that exist between countries in the continent and other parts of the world. And those have to be respected as well. So it's also how do you harmonize what we have internally, and then also take into account external agreements. We have AGOA, for example. We have everything but arms with the EU, for instance. And then you even have individual bilateral trade agreements that add further complexity. So it's a work in progress. To the question on visa-free Africa, this was actually an initiative that we also undertook at the World Economic Forum. So to begin with, for many countries, visa is a security document as well. It's a way of assessing whether whoever is coming into your country can be trusted or not, right? So it's a document that serves many purposes. So it's not just capturing information, but it's by and large, it's about managing national security. With that in mind, what we try to do in the World Economic Forum, working with our stakeholders, was to do a mapping across the continent of different regimes and essentially illuminate where there were discrepancies. So, for example, you could have, let's say, countries A, B, C, D, E, right? So countries A, B, C all accept visas from country D. Country E accepts visas from only 2 of the countries, right? But is eligible to all. And so there was essentially what we're trying to illustrate was that there was a lack of consistency, and using that to nudge countries and those concerned about security to review how they were determining which countries were riskier than others, to check in with their colleagues as to why they were able to have no visa restrictions for countries, how are they doing their assessments on a security basis or otherwise. So for example, you've mentioned, say, Rwanda. Rwanda is also part of EAC. So people could argue, well, if Rwanda can go visa-free, why can't the other countries in EAC go visa-free? In EAC, we don't need visas, right? So how is Rwanda making its assessment that makes it access easier from across the continent? Or why is it easier for countries outside the continent to have access to countries within the continent? And the outcome of this exercise was actually a visa index, that is a visa openness index that is actually managed and housed at the African Development Bank. So every year, at least to the best of my knowledge, but at least by the time I left the World Economic Forum, there was a report that was being issued, and it would show the improvements, and there are improvements. You see that happening over time. But just underpinning it is security considerations and the ability also within countries and the collaboration between countries as well in terms of exchange of information, and hopefully as we continue to digitalize our systems and get them to speak to each other, that will also speed up this process of harmonization as far as visa openness is concerned.
And Serge, did you have a question?
Yeah. So I'd like to move to another side, because people like me who are not in diplomatic world, some questions. So African countries are 54, which means that at least the continent put at in US 108 ambassadors. So I imagine what will be the strength if all these countries, all these ambassadors decide to put together their voice. I want to know if they think about that, because in my view, if all the ambassadors who are in US decide to put together their voice, something that occur on an African continent would not be like this, and we would negotiate a very big side of with the international community toward African countries.
So what you have around the world, and including in Washington, D.C., is what you call what is called an Africa Diplomatic Group. For us, it's Africa Diplomatic Corps actually have a group. And these groups meet on a regular basis to discuss issues that are of common interest. And this is particularly important when you have issues that are time sensitive. So for example, right now we're talking about the renewal of AGOA, ago is the Africa Growth and Opportunity Act, which essentially allows for tariff-free entry into the US market. It's going to come up for renewal next year, and so it affects all countries that are eligible, and therefore we come together to assess where we are, how to engage the US administration, how to engage Congress, what are the various concerns, and how do we amplify them as a bloc. And these groups are all around the world. So for instance, my colleague from Korea shared that yesterday was Africa Day, and there was a Korea-Africa program that took place that involved not just the Africa group, but also key officials from the Korean government and private sector, because Korea will be hosting Korea-Africa Summit in June. And so you have these groups that do come together around the world. Some are stronger than others, but essentially they're trying to do exactly what you have alluded to.
So I have my own favorite questions, but I'm thinking I should be deferential a little bit to the audience, and also to something that I know about you, which is, like I said, the Tanzanian embassy and you yourself have described, agreed on this idea that, you're part of your work, your presence as ambassador and as a thinker is to change the narrative of Africa. And Tom's question actually also gives you a chance to do that. In some sense, to tell us the success stories that, the African story can be from the outside viewed very bleakly all the time. And would you like, so maybe you could tell us about some of the success stories that Tom has in mind, but perhaps speak more generally about, you also described yourself as an Afro-optimist. And if I can open the door for you to walk through.
Well, one, I'm an Afro-optimist, as I hope many of my fellow Africans here are, based on the changes that I've seen happen just in my own lifetime, right? I arrived in Dar es Salaam in '96, and it's a very different world today. You have flyovers, you have high-rise buildings, you have multi-lane roads and highways. There's a lot of activity that's going on. We have special economic zones coming up, more manufacturing, there's more activity, there's more Tanzanian CEOs. 25 years ago, there was very few, there were a lot of expatriate CEOs, and now we have Tanzanians that are CEOs of multinational companies. So there's very vivid and visible changes that have taken place, leave alone, as economists, you look at the data, so you see what's happening as far as GDP is concerned, with fiscal and macroeconomic numbers. So not just from a statistics point of view, but physically being able to see what transformation is taking place. What concerned me, particularly living outside the continent, was one, how limited the knowledge was of what was happening in the continent. And there's very limited information or news about Africa in global media unless it is negative, right? This is something we're all very much aware of. So whether it's about, there's always bad news, and bad news sells. And a key concern, particularly at the forum where I had responsibility for for marketing, if I can call it that, sub-Saharan Africa, so you could draw interest, whether it is to assist from a philanthropic point of view or to invest. First and foremost, it starts off with raising awareness about what was going on so that people had a realistic picture of the continent. I'm not saying all is rosy, we know that's not true. We've recently had a number of coups, but there's stabilization, and there's different views also about what is driving the conflicts that we see on the continent and how they're being addressed. But really the story of what positive things are happening was not making its way to the global stage. And so a big part of the effort of changing the narrative was about, well, how do we showcase what is happening in Africa, and also how do we expand the space for Africans on the global stage, so they're able to share their own stories, right? Not just as consumers, but also of creators of the changes that were taking place on the continent. One area where I would say we were fairly successful was when, this would be about 2015, 2016, was when the chairman of the World Economic Forum penned a book on the Fourth Industrial Revolution. It's it brought together and brought to the surface all the technological changes that were taking place. So the forum didn't create the term Fourth Industrial Revolution, but he certainly sort of amplified and made it more visible to the world about how digital technology and technology in general, new technologies, were changing how we work, how we live. And we were not fully aware as a global society as to what these changes were and how we were adapting to them and how we were leveraging them. And the general perception at that time, I remember speaking to colleagues, for instance, about this would be sort of Bitcoin and the sort of new fintech solutions about blockchain, and that they were having discussions about blockchain, the impact of blockchain technology in the financial space, but we're not involving any Africans. They says, oh, you mean is blockchain technology happening? I said, absolutely. And cryptocurrencies are also being utilized, and so therefore our central bank governors definitely have an interest in understanding how the world is addressing the challenges that arise therefrom. And they have something to say. So they're not just listeners, but these activities are happening on the continent. What we're able to also showcase was what new innovations were coming up from the continent as well, whether it's drone technology. Now we talk sort of about AI, there's 3D technology, and showcasing what creations and inventions were actually emerging from the continent. So fast forward to today, we have a handful of unicorns that have emerged from the continent. So these are tech companies that have managed to raise a valuation of $1 billion, was not expected. They're very successful, operating across multiple countries. I'd say arguably in almost every country you have some tech pioneers that are globally competitive. That was also unheard of. At that time, it's become a lot more apparent. We have hubs, I would say, with President Ruto's visit from Kenya, and you saw the commitments made by the US government. That's a clear demonstration of how far we've come in terms of the world taking more seriously what is happening in that corner of the world, and really demonstrating that while the footprint may be smaller on the continent, but we're definitely present, right? Going back to Tom's question also about other success stories, this one that emerged from the COVID-19 pandemic that we're perhaps less aware of. There was challenges with getting access to vaccines, and for a long time there was an aspiration on the part of policymakers in particular to prioritize pharmaceutical industries and being able to produce and manufacture medicines on the continent. With the way things played out and issues related to supply chains in terms of vaccine access, there was a fast tracking of establishing centers of excellence on the continent to manufacture COVID-19 vaccines in the continent, and that happened in a very short time, but they were able to get up and running. We have an Africa CDC center that's doing very well. We recently had the opening of an Africa Medicines Agency in Rwanda that will also help us to fast track how we work together to speed up also alignment, research, as well as licensing of life-saving medicines. And so that's one came about. It needed a lot of rallying. A lot of the patents for generic drugs actually held in the global north, so those negotiations that had to take place and some concessions that had to be made so that the drugs that were manufactured on the continent would also be more accessible in terms of affordability. That's one intervention that definitely will have a far-reaching impact. And I'm glad that we're able to make it happen. And Africa, thank God, it did not see the high deaths that had been projected. It was actually one of the least impacted as far as the COVID-19 pandemic is concerned.
So we're at about an hour now, and we don't want to go a whole lot longer. But I do feel like, given the time and the times we live in, I should ask you talk briefly about climate change. It seems like the issue is hot in every sense of the word. It also seems really sort of at the heart of development economics, in the sense that, as everybody says, Africa is really not responsible for the problem. I think some few percent of global emissions to date are from Africa, but is hugely vulnerable to the problem. And so in terms of, just as a very broad question, you can go wherever you like with it, in terms of the way the international community is addressing the problem, what would you like to see different? What do you think is being done right? I just want you to talk a little bit, so in some sense this discussion would be incomplete without some reference to this major issue.
Sure. So as some of you may be aware, well, we've all seen the impact of climate change and how it's changing weather patterns. You've experienced it here in Williams. I understand you had a mild-ish winter. When I was here, it snowed early. I believe it was Thanksgiving, and it stayed until May. So it's hard to believe that it's so warm at this time of the year here. And so with that reality, we recently were just emerging from a period of floods. There were heavy floods in Tanzania and in Kenya. We have neighbors that have suffered from severe droughts, very unusual for this time of the year. And these are just recent examples that underscore the concern from the developing world to say, well, the more developed economies in the world have contributed the most to polluting the atmosphere and putting us in this situation. We are still developing, but now we're having constraints imposed on us as to how we can develop, but more importantly, the negative impacts of this climate change are being felt by us and being experienced by us. Now, this is a concern from a global point of view, that we are suffering the most, yet we have contributed the least to the problem. And what that calls for in terms of fairness principle is a transfer of resources from countries, one, that are better off, to help us to adapt to this situation. And this has been the appeal, the major platform for negotiations about how to address the climate change crisis is the COP. And at each COP, we keep reminding the world that you promised us that you would compensate us and help us cope with this situation, but we don't see the money flowing that was promised hitherto, and the situation is getting worse. And so that's a constant appeal. Where is the money that was promised? That's the climate finance, and how can you help us cope better? And that's not forthcoming. So that's one concern, the whole climate finance agenda, and assisting us with adaptation to cope with this new normal. The second key concern is what we've seen emerging, right? The world is very sophisticated, is a new platform, which is carbon markets. And so carbon markets are a solution, I'd say arguably driven by the private sector. It's a private sector oriented solution to finding the finance that can help us address the challenges arising from climate change. The issue is that while that may be a potential source of financing to assist our countries to cope with this new normal, the terms are set outside the continent, very difficult to get qualified as a company that can actually conduct the assessment of whether it's carbon emissions or what they call carbon sinks, so your ability to actually take emissions out of the atmosphere. And so it feels that even this new solution, which should ideally benefit us because we can also contribute the most to reducing emissions in the atmosphere, are being controlled again by the global north. So the benefits are also accruing back to those who created the problem, as opposed to evening out and helping to support countries that are part of the solution. So again, there's ongoing negotiations there about how we can have a rebalancing also and ensure that our countries are also able to play an active part in solving this problem, and are also able to benefit directly, not by using our forests, but by having, whether it's Tanzanians actually benefit from these carbon sinks in their countries, or Gabon. Gabon has a blue bond that's quite interesting to look at what kind of innovations are coming up. But again, how do we ensure that Gabonese are benefiting? Someone told me there's a large, very well-known EV company, I won't mention the name as a diplomat, that is benefiting more from the carbon markets than from actually selling the cars. So they challenged me to look up their shareholding reports, and I haven't gotten around to doing it, but if that is the case, I mean, that's terrible. But just goes to show you that there's a skewing of this particular solution that, again, is not in favor of the countries that have contributed the least to the situation. The third key element, which is also another area of concern, is fossil fuels. So as I said, we're still evolving. We have fossil fuels, oil, gas, coal, and the world is saying, well, hang on, right? If you go down the development path that we went through, then you're going to emit more carbons into the atmosphere. So don't use that, use other resources. I don't know if you've ever seen or if you're familiar with industries that are running on solar. It doesn't work. The battery technology is not there. They can't run 24 hours in a day. Geothermal is a little bit better, wind. So these resources are not yet at a point where they can support our industrialization endeavors. And in more developed parts of the world, they're not using them for those purposes. So there's still a concern that we should be allowed to use the resources that we have. And let's talk about technologies that can be used or invested in that would help to reduce the emissions from utilizing these fossil fuels. The quagmire that we find ourselves in is because of the global shift and the power imbalances, if I may call it that. There are penalties being imposed on financiers and financial institutions and companies to invest in fossil fuels. So while we may have the resources, while we may have the arguments, we're not able to tap into foreign direct investment and global capital to help us to transform those resources and use them to advance our economies. And as one former African president put very eloquently on a global stage in Washington, D.C., where he basically appealed, and he was very forthcoming and said, for the rest of the world, you talk about moving from dirty energy to clean energy. In our part of the world, we're taking people out of the dark and into the light. They could care less where that electricity is coming from. So what is our responsibility? You asked about politicians. So should I say, yes, you may have the gas, but we can't use it because the world says we can't, so we have to wait until they give us the technology or feel sorry for us, and then we'll provide it to you. So until then, keep waiting, right? And we'll get to you when the rest of the world says it's okay. It doesn't work, right? That's just it's irresponsible on the part of leaders on the continent. And the last point I will raise, just on that point, so it's an ongoing discussion, and there's been a softening and understanding and appreciating where we're coming from, and lifting of penalties, and spending more time on sort of the R&D and new innovations that can help us. I mean, we're not interested in just polluting the atmosphere either. It's just, let's find a middle ground, but we need to use what we have. And the last point I'll make is that there's also been a challenge around how we think about climate change, and this very much depends on where you're sitting in the world. And most recently, my president, Dr. Samia Suluhu Hassan, was part of a group of leaders that were in Paris championing Clean Cooking Stoves initiative, and essentially mobilizing the global community to fund this particular endeavor. President Samir previously raised this at the last COP and is championing it on the part of Africa. This is not a new initiative. India's done quite well. We have examples also from Latin America, but it's one which is very important when you think about how many women are being negatively impacted from a health perspective. Most unfortunately, they're using charcoal and firewood, right, and kerosene, but the deforestation is definitely negative with respect to the climate change agenda. And with growing populations, right, the decimation of that forest is actually being accelerated. So when you think about, you know, what's critical from a climate change point of view, it's like, well, this is one area that will make a difference to millions and millions of lives on the continent. How can we get, you know, the attention of the world to invest as much in thinking through which technologies and alternatives can help us transform this situation in the shortest time possible, and as in the same vein as attention is being paid to how to improve carbon markets, right, and create carbon sinks and other solutions. So there's this imbalance also about what makes the most sense in terms of the impact on people's lives in the developing world vis-a-vis what is top of mind from the particularly the global North perspective, which has very real implications on which way resources are allocated and what pressures are put to bear. And I believe you had mentioned this issue of this carbon tax that the EU has introduced. Reading up on it, I discovered they're not the only ones. The US also apparently is talking about it. But interventions, and this is a great place to stop, is that by undertaking policy interventions and legislative changes also in the global North, seeking to address this challenge, right? And it's essentially trying to influence consumer behavior. Doesn't take into account the negative impact that it has on other parts of the world. So we already struggle with exporting our goods to the EU, North America, particularly on the basis of sanitary and phytosanitary standards, so meeting the standards that are required. Introducing a carbon tax element where you're now taxing people to figure out how they assess what the contribution of those products has been from a carbon perspective means you're really shutting the doors and saying, don't come here, right? You'll never be able to access our markets. And the question is that what you want to do, right? Can we find a different way of trying to address consumer behavior that takes into account how it impacts the rest of the world and the decisions that have to be made? And the last one was I was teasing Tom also about whether he drives an electric vehicle or not, where the US administration is also sort of incentivizing this shift to cleaner, greener use of energy. A question I'd like to ask consumers in the US in particular, but was really brought to the forefront of my mind by private sector investing in critical minerals in Tanzania and in the region, was that, and back to your point about the resource curse. So for a long time, because of different kinds of practices and poor governance, by and large, the mining sector has gained a very negative reputation, also in terms of the impact on the environment. As we talk about moving to greener, cleaner products, and with electric vehicles being part of that agenda, many consumers don't realize that it all starts with mining, right? And so mining still has a negative reputation, but it's directly, inherently linked to a greener, cleaner agenda. And so again, it's, how do we strike the right balance so that people fully appreciate what it means? And one of the issues that we're raising, and I'll leave you with this thought, is that what we need, if we want a different future for mining, which means we're upholding the highest principles, say ESG, so environment, sustainability, right, as well as how we're dealing with people, is for consumers to accept to pay more, for better practices in terms of mining, that children are not being used in the mines, right? That the best governance principles are being applied, and how many people will be willing to pay more. And right now, they're not. Right? And that is the challenge that some of our private sector people have shared and said, let's talk to the off-takers. So we're having discussions in Washington as well and saying, listen, we have to introduce a premium, and where the consumer insists that I want to know, right? Let's trace back on where these minerals in whatever I'm consuming is coming from, right? And to be able to determine that the highest principles have been applied, and I'm willing to pay more. So it's not just an EV, but it's an EV that can, that has a stamp on it, that this upholds the highest principles. If we're able to do that, then we will change how we move forward. If we don't, then it's a race to the bottom again. It's just it depends on who can pull it out faster, can process it faster. Nobody cares where it came from. You just drive your vehicle. You don't know where it came from. You don't know what impact it had, but you feel good about yourself and that you are somehow contributing to a cleaner, greener world. So I'll leave you on that thought.
So there's a lot more to talk about, but I think we need to bring the formal part of this discussion to a close. I want to thank Ambassador Kanza. 2 fascinating discussions, many informal discussions outside. We were delighted to have you here in such beautiful weather. I hope you enjoy the rest of your stay, and thank you all for coming.